Out, and then we move to the final part of the series, which is selecting in, and how you can relate that back to the interview process and what happens beyond that.
Yeah, this is the good bit, because this is the bit where you're actually face to face with a person. So this is where a lot more of our biases tend to come in. So you've designed the job you're recruiting for, you've selected out the candidates that aren't suitable, and now you want to whittle it down to the final person. So for decades, a typical option on this has been interviews. You get to view the suitability of the person, you get to know them as a person, but you also the candidate gets the ability to build what we call the psychological contract. That getting to know the organisation, do I see myself as fitting in there? So the two-way aspect of that interview process, which is really important for building the future relationship you're going to have with that candidate.
Definitely.
However, unfortunately, interviews are not always a positive experience. And also, decisions that are made in those interviews are not always fair, and again, not always consciously, but they're not always fair. So there's a few things that you can be on the lookout for and things that we can do better, but this has a greater chance of happening with people from protected groups or minoritized groups. Particularly, as we've talked about, female candidates, pregnant candidates, this can be a particularly difficult area, because it's the point where these things can't necessarily be hidden if you're pregnant, and there's a lot of discrimination around that in job interviews. Despite the evidence to show that a lot of interviews can be potentially biased, most people, interviewers, believe that they are the exception and that they are the person that has that good gut feel and actually is really good at interviewing. So we're in that really strange position of it being one of the prime areas for discrimination to occur, but also the point where we don't realise it's happening. There's a few things, like I said, there's a few things that we can do to overcome this. So let's start first of all with the point at which the person walks in the door and starts to do the interview. So normally what would happen is you get introduced and you want to put the candidate at ease. So you have a few conversations, you have a bit of a chat about the journey they had over here.
Certainly.
What did they do on the weekend? You know, they might raise a little bit about their hobbies and have a little bit of a chat about that, just to put them at their ease before you launch into the questions. Now, unfortunately, as we've said in previous videos, that brings about that like me bias of all of a sudden going, oh great, you know, you do triathlons, I do triathlons, brilliant, you're just like me, you're gonna be excellent. Again, that's obviously unfair, but not necessarily something we know, because what we're looking for is our gut feel of fit. Are they going to fit in my team? So as you can see, it's always a bit of a difficult area. Now, one of the ways I've seen this dealt with really well in the past is having another person that brings the person so meets them at the door, brings them into the interview room, potentially sits them down, gets them a glass of water. They do that, putting them at ease, chat. They may tell them what's going to happen in the interview, explain to them how the process is going to work. When the person's calm, they then usher them through into the room where the interviewer or the panel of interviewers is sat, and they flow into the interview. And I've seen that done really well, and that way you get both elements of it. You get the person able to talk to somebody who's potentially doing the job that they might be applying for, and also being put at their ease.
Yes.
So that's a great way to start. The next two, slightly harder, and maybe sometimes these might require the involvement of a business psychologist. So developing structured interview questions that relate back to the skills and competencies you've identified in your job description.
Okay.
And this is how everything all flows together. Now, these structured questions should be asked exactly the same to every interviewee.
So it's continuity.
Yeah, and they should also be given a similar level of neutral feedback. Now, this is really hard to do when you're an interviewer, because we all want to say, oh, you're doing really well, or we want to say things like, that's great, or thank you. It's really difficult because an interviewee might take prompts from that might change the way that they act. So we've got to try and be neutral with every candidate that we're with. And that, moving on to the next point, that can take a little bit of training with your interviewers. It can take a little bit of practice to get them comfortable with that element of having that neutral conversation with the person. And the final element of this, which is also where the training comes in, is the ability to score a question.
Okay.
So it's quite, being in an interview situation is very as difficult for the interviewer as it is for the interviewee.
Both ways.
They've got to take in so much information, they've got to retain as much of it as they can to be able to go back and actually score it without bringing their bias in. That can be quite a difficult thing to do, and like I say, it can take training. And then normally what would happen after that, especially if you've got more than one interviewer, is you might get together to discuss the candidates. One of the things I would urge is to make sure that you do any scoring before you get together.
Yep.
So there's some really good research, again, there's some really good papers about how people can be influenced by potentially a more senior person.
Yep.
So if I get together in a room and my boss goes, I love that person, all of a sudden I'm going, ooh, well, I wasn't sure, but ooh, my boss loves them, so I'm going to bump them up a point because my boss loves them, and I'm getting influenced by it. So if we want to be truly independent on what we're saying, we should be scoring beforehand. Yeah, so there's quite a few things there that we might be looking at, but I think overall there's definitely some tips that people can take away from.
Yeah, and I think all the information you've given is really, really vital, and I think one of the things you're right about, certainly about scoring them first before your boss opens his mouth, because I've sat on interviews where where you thought this candidate is never ever in a million years going to be able to do this job. The boss says, yeah, I love that guy, really thought he was great, he's going to be great, and the next thing you know, you're thinking, you know what, I'm not going to say anything here, I'm just going to say, yeah, he's really great. If it's a mess, then it's on the boss's head.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I totally agree. Whereas if you were allowed to be honest and open in the outset and say exactly what you think, and then scores are compared genuinely, I think you'd see a very different picture of recruitment. So I totally agree with you. I think it would massively reduce the amount of bias in the process. And I think that's what the aim should be, is to try and increase the amount of diversity in an organisation, because that brings so much. And maybe next series that we do it will be a little bit more on diversity and how that can help. And so the purpose is to reduce bias, to increase diversity within your organisation. But thank you very much.
No worries, I've really enjoyed it.
Same here. I think it's been very. It's been a really eye-opener in a lot of ways, and I think it should highlight how many areas that we have where bias can occur, and there's a few tidbits in there that you can sort of help people, but I'm sure there'll be links at the bottom of the video to get in touch directly with Victoria. So if you want to have a consultation with her, all the information will be there, or with myself if you wanted to sit down and look at your recruitment as a whole. I'm more than happy to do that. Well, thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much.
Cheers.